It is Election Day in America, and while voters are not selecting a president nor members of Congress, there are plenty of races and ballot questions that are bound to reframe the nation's political landscape. Most eyes are on the Virginia gubernatorial race. Polls have shown it remains close between former Democratic Governor Terry McAuliffe and first-time Republican candidate Glenn Youngkin. They made their final pitches to voters last night.
I want every woman to listen to me closely. I will and was a brick wall to protect your reproductive rights. Men like Donald Trump and Glenn Youngkin should not be telling women what to do with their bodies.
I'm worried about the future of our children. I'm worried about the future of Virginia's economy. I'm worried about getting our taxes down. I'm worried about our communities being safe. And we are all worried about that together, and that's why when we press forward on day one, we are going to work.
Meanwhile, New Jersey voters will be deciding whether to give Democratic Governor Phil Murphy a second term or go with former Republican Assemblyman Jack Ciattarelli. While the Garden State leans blue, the most recent Republican governors elected there were in 1994 and 2009, right after a Democratic administration took over the White House. For an in-depth look at Election Day 2021, I want to bring in CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett, who joins me from the CBS Broadcast Center in New York. Major, great to see you. So I want to begin with Virginia. What issues have shaped this race in the final weeks, and what does it say about the larger political landscape for both parties?
Without question, education has been the issue that has driven all the conversation the closing days of the Virginia governor's race. Education is historically a net positive issue for Democrats. That has not been the way it has turned out in this election. Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, has identified and essentially given sympathetic voice to parents in a couple of very key Virginia counties, Fairfax County and Loudoun County, who have been going to school board meetings complaining about a couple of things: transgender policies in those school districts and so-called critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is not taught in Virginia schools, but there have been instructional manuals indicating that it's important to broaden the conversation in classrooms about the history of race in America, and particularly in Virginia. Republicans have branded all of that as critical race theory and demonized it. And Glenn Youngkin has identified with that issue very, very strongly. And suddenly, education and the grassroots sentiment around it, sparked by parent resistance to these initiatives that they either don't understand or outright oppose, has given Youngkin real momentum. And you look at the closing days of this race, he has had the crowds, he has had the polling momentum, and Republicans who I know who work very closely on Virginia politics and who are candid when Republicans are going to win and when they're going to lose have told me they expect Youngkin to win this race and probably win it outside of that narrow range of 1 or 2%. They predict he could win by as much as 5%. And if he does, it will be because of this education issue. Also, the broader sense in Virginia, as elsewhere, reflected in national polls, that Joe Biden as president has underperformed, and since the Afghanistan withdrawal looked weaker and less competent than voters are pleased with, and there's a message there as well.
And Garrett, what about sort of the elephant in the room? Former President Trump spoke at a tele-rally last night in support of Youngkin. How has Youngkin walked the delicate tightrope, at least there in Virginia, of embracing and distancing himself from the former president at the same time?
I'm not sure tightrope is the best metaphor. I really do think the Youngkin campaign made it clear they wanted no surrogates in Virginia, including President Trump. President Trump has involved himself in the race in the closing days because, I am told, he believes Youngkin's going to win and he wants to share and bask in some of the credit for that, even though he won't deserve very much of it. And Youngkin's campaign has calculated that there is no practical downside to having Trump involved in the race because they think they're going to win in a safe enough margin and Trump won't do any damage. The idea for the Youngkin campaign, expressed repeatedly in private conversations with those around former President Trump, is don't get involved. I've said generally complimentary things about the former president, but I don't want this race in any way, shape, or form to be about former President Trump. I want to run my own race. I don't want other Republican surrogates, names from the Senate or governors or House members to come here. I want to run this race entirely on my own and win or lose it entirely on my own. That's the way Youngkin has tried to tell Virginia voters, independents, and some maybe vulnerable or movable Democrats that he's his own man and he's not necessarily an acolyte or a follower in every way of former President Trump. Now, clearly, Terry McAuliffe, the Democratic nominee, has tried to do this repeatedly, over and over and over, say, yes, Glenn Youngkin is just like President Trump. Tried to make this race essentially a referendum, if not on the former president, on Trumpism as a political aspect of American life. Youngkin has tried to maneuver his way around that, and by identifying himself with his education issue and Biden fatigue, as I mentioned earlier, it appears he has succeeded in doing that.
I would imagine that this fits in just fine for Mr. Trump himself. In essence, he can, take credit if he wins and say he didn't bring me in close enough if he loses, correct?
Precisely. And what former President Trump will say is, I have a base. If my base turns out, then Glenn Youngkin will win. The Youngkin campaign believes it has built its entire race itself. And yes, if you're a Republican and you're running in the post-Trump or neo-post-Trump era, we're not really sure where we're living in, but it's a certainly Trump-influenced era in Republican politics. You can't say negative things about former President Trump, but you can try to be modestly positive, but much more affirmative about who you are and what your agenda is. And one other thing I want to mention about this education issue is, think about it this way. When you're talking about an issue that crosses parties and crosses geography, education is a pretty good one, because parents either are, have been, or might be. That crosses a lot of territory. Either I am a parent and I'm concerned about this, or I was a parent and I would be if I still was, or I might be a parent and this is relevant to me. And that's where Youngkin has really tried to take this issue in a less distinctly partisan way and galvanize available and movable independents and movable Democrats. And if he wins tonight, one of the reasons he will have won is doing precisely that.
Yes, but don't you think, Major, that in the pool of voters who call themselves parents and who are therefore interested in education, there is disagreement on, how parents should influence school boards? Oh,
certainly. There is a big disagreement, and I'm not trying to suggest that every parent is going to view this one way or the other. But if you're looking at an issue that has proved motivating in this race, and even if it's not about transgender policies or critical race theory or any kind of new race-based curriculum in schools, what it does suggest, and what voters have been responding to, and this shows on the public polls in Virginia, is that some parents who have moved to the Youngkin campaign also identify with the sense that either they're not being heard or school boards are being resistant to their voice even being present in these conversations, and they feel alienated from that overall process. Those kinds of things are having a real effect. Trust me, when this campaign began, the Youngkin campaign did not believe it would make significant inroads into Fairfax County or Loudoun County. It appears that it has, and that's because it has identified itself with this issue, which was there before at the grassroots level, and it's sort of become a larger metaphor for parents or those who are up for grabs about Terry McAuliffe and what they think their priorities are, looking at school boards, education, and these issues in perhaps a broader context. But you're right. People who look at education draw different conclusions. Terry McAuliffe has said, look, I'll raise teacher pay, I'll invest in education. That's certainly going to be a powerful message, and many Democrats will come out in support of that. But if you're trying to win as the challenger, an untested Republican like Glenn Youngkin is, you have to find something that has a motivating dynamic behind it that brings you crowds and closes the polls. Well, that's what's happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks in Virginia.
Youngkin definitely found an issue that resonated. All right, so I want to now bring in CBS News political reporter Adam Brewster. He joins me from North Arlington, New Jersey. That's the other gubernatorial race we're following. Adam, in New Jersey, just like in Virginia, big-time Democrats have campaigned for Governor Murphy. What was the strategy behind bringing in outsiders, especially in a state that is already primarily blue?
Right, it is a reliably blue state in federal elections when there's a presidential election at stake, certainly in U.S. Senate elections too. But because of its off-year gubernatorial election, there have been Republican successes here. I mean, Chris Christie was the governor for 8 years just a handful of years ago. No Democrat has been reelected in New Jersey since 1977. That's one of the trends that Democratic incumbent Governor Phil Murphy is hoping to break. And, part of the reason why he brought in some of those outside figures was to draw up enthusiasm. Senator Bernie Sanders was here at Rutgers just last week I spoke to someone walking over who was so excited to go see Bernie Sanders. You know, she thought Phil Murphy was a good governor and he was fine. Certainly didn't speak about him the way that she spoke about Bernie Sanders, and said that she liked that they were standing there side by side, sort of singing, you know, from the same songbook. And, you know, she was planning to go out there and vote for Governor Murphy. And so it was sort of a way to close any enthusiasm gap that may exist between Democrats and Republicans. There's 1 million more Democrats than Republicans from a registered voter standpoint in New Jersey. There are still about 2.5 million independent voters. Those are sometimes the folks who end up deciding these races in these off-year elections. When New Jersey moved to this off-year cycle, the governor at the time said he wanted the state to be free of sort of what was happening at the national level in these decision-making, but by bringing in those national figures, certainly Governor Murphy injecting at least a bit of national feelings into this race.
Absolutely. And Adam, as we were talking about earlier, New Jersey voted for Republican governors most recently, right after a Democratic president was elected. So has Ciattarelli sort of galvanized on that point? How has he made this a competitive race?
But he's focused a lot of his race on taxes, and taxes have been high in New Jersey for a long time. It's certainly not something that started the day Phil Murphy took office 4 years ago. And he's been pressed about that, you know, saying Republican governors like Chris Christie haven't fixed the tax problem. What makes you think you will? And he talks about a new formula that he has for the school funding, which is what drives a lot of the high property taxes here in New Jersey, and that's been his focus. He has tried to make his campaign focused on New Jersey issues. Much like Glenn Youngkin in Virginia, he has not brought in many high-profile national surrogates. Ronna McDaniel, the chairwoman of the Republican National Committee, was here at one point. Nikki Haley, the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, former South Carolina governor, was here back in the summer. But for the most part, he has run this race on his own. He said he wants to run this race on his own, and he has sort of tried to weave that line of making sure that the Republican base, the Trump base, is engaged. Now, the former president is not entirely popular in New Jersey, but he does have a base here. And he's also tried to walk the line of not poking that base in the eye while talking to voters, people who may be inclined to vote for Republicans in these state races based on fiscal issues, saying, I'm someone who can fix the affordability issues in this state. I'm somebody who will be good for business in New Jersey, and trying to speak to some of those voters who may have been disaffected with former President Trump, trying to win them over. We'll see how close he gets. This was a state that President Biden won by about 15 points last year, and it appears that it's going to be much closer than certainly Governor Murphy and other Democrats thought it would be when the calendar turned to 2021 back in January, even as recently as this summer.
Right. Yeah, you can certainly draw some similarities between these two races, and that you have these Republican challengers facing these Democratic incumbents in these blue states, and they are sort of playing that balanced game with Trump supporters. It's very interesting. There are definitely some similarities in the two races. Well, Major Garrett and Adam Brewster, thanks to both of you for joining us. We appreciate it.